you. Thank you. So just to put a plug in up front, so this is our first in a series of seminars this year. So we're very glad to be welcoming Dr. Saldana today. As you can see, we have a number of other great speakers. I'll just put in a plug for our next speaker in October, Dr. Walter Wittich. So he's at the University of Montreal, and he's a great advocate for the deaf-blind community, does a lot of work with that community, really thinking about accessibility and use through particularly assistive technologies to help with accessibility for that community. So we hope you can join us then. We also ask that you save the date. So every year we have a big event, our Cochlear Center Research Day. Our keynote speaker this year will be Dr. Malaz Bustani. And so he's at Indiana University and really a leader in the field of implementation science. So please mark that calendar for Friday, April 17th. We'll have the keynote. We'll also have a great lunch for those of you who are local and really a focus on some student work at a poster presentation afterwards. And so now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Ian Saldana is an associate professor here at the Bloomberg School of Public Health in the Department of Epidemiology with a joint appointment in Health Policy and Management. He is co-director of the Johns Hopkins Evidence-Based Practice Center and also part of the Center for Clinical Trials and Evidence Synthesis, and most importantly, part of our center here as well, the Cochlear Center. He's a fellow of the Society for Research Synthesis Methodology, and also one of the co-editors for Epidemiologic Reviews, which is a journal that's run here out of Hopkins. He earned his MBBS degree at Grant Medical College in Mumbai, India, and his MPH and PhD in epidemiology here at the Bloomberg School. After completing his training, he joined our faculty for a couple of years as an assistant scientist before joining the faculty at Brown University as an assistant professor. And we're very, very lucky that you are now back with us starting in 2023. And I think you'll see part of why we're lucky here as part of his talk today. So he really is an amazing teacher, a really great educator, and has won a number of awards for his work in that space, including a Golden Apple here. His research really has two main focuses: the conduct, methodological development, and application of evidence synthesis and clinical trials in an array of topics, but also in outcome measurement and ophthalmology, especially ocular surface diseases such as dry eye. And so he'll be talking to us about that today. So welcome, Ian.
All right, thank you, Dr. Deal, for that. I'm going to try walking around a little bit, and let me know if that doesn't quite work well for the audio or the video. Thank you for the invitation. It's excellent to be here and to speak with you about some of my work. I'm going to start out with a bit of Q&A, and imagine we were all making a decision about a robot vacuum that we want to buy. What might be some things we want to know about potential vacuums that are out there?
Can it handle dog hair?
Can it handle dog hair? So pet capabilities, yes. How long does it charge? How much does it cost? How much area can it cover? Are there any responses from online in the chat maybe?
I'm monitoring, nothing yet.
Oh, nothing yet. Other things you might want to know.
What surfaces can it go on?
What surfaces can it go into? What does it not fit into, right? What else? Yes. Will it fall down the stairs? What else? How noisy is it? Yeah, we may want to do reading while we're there, so that might bother us. What else?
Maintenance.
What maintenance is involved? Okay, good. We've heard cost already, so good. Any other things? I think we've covered a good bunch of things. Consumer reports. I think many of us might be familiar with this. It's a service that you have online that puts out a set of characteristics of different existing products within a certain category. So just to zoom in on that particular thing a little more, Consumer reports for robotic vacuums looks a little like this. This is from a while ago. They've come down in price a little bit now. You see here iRobot, which is a popular brand. There are some other brands. This is just the top, 10 or so. You see in the columns of this matrix, you see aspects that you might care about. So things that we've talked about. So we talked about pet hair a little bit. Does it handle pet hair? Cost is there. We see predictability, satisfaction. We see how does it do with carpet, bare floors. What's the clearance, Wi-Fi connectivity, which is an important aspect as well, navigation, etc. And we see here, and as you see in the legend, you see a bunch of indicators to say how well does each particular product score for that particular metric. What if, unfortunately, it looked like this? And there's a bunch of information that's missing for several products, for several of those indicators or outcomes that we looked at. So I'm going to go back the slide and see how nice we could now look down a column in this previous scenario and say, yeah, that particular bare floors, they all seem to do well. Some products do better than others in terms of pet hair, which was important to us. So we are able to look across and make decisions. Unfortunately, much of the research healthcare landscape that we work with in clinical trials or in evidence synthesis, it's a lot like this. We're trying to decide among what looks best or what looks better than others in terms of treatments. We often don't have information. Things are grayed out. Things are just not reported because different trialists, different researchers value different things. And there's no unified sense of what is important necessarily. So with that bit of a setup, I'd like to talk about the outline for what I'll cover today. Some challenges with heterogeneity and outcome use in clinical research, a potential part of the solution to the problem, and then describe some initial and ongoing work within the field of dry eye that we are trying to address this problem. What is dry eye? It's put quite simply, it's a condition that occurs when either your eyes don't produce enough tears or they produce enough, but the tears evaporate too quickly. So either way, there's not enough tears on the surface of the eye. More formally, it's a multifactorial condition of the ocular surface that's characterized by loss of homeostasis of the tear film, or stability of the tear film, and accompanying symptoms in which tear film instability and hyperosmolarity, ocular surface inflammation and damage of the ocular surface, and neurosensory abnormalities play etiological roles in the disease pathology. Within the field of ophthalmology more broadly, and specifically within the field of dry eye, a bunch of years ago, we did some patient engagement work where we engaged a large sample of patients online, and we tried to get information about the outcomes that are out there in the field. But as part of that work, we did a preliminary scoping of what's out there in the research related to dry eye. You see here, we talk about how there were, at the time, 158 trials, but you might imagine dryness of the eye is one aspect. There were 109 different outcomes that were measured and reported across these studies and systematic reviews in the field. So quite a bit of multiplicity. Then we did a piece of work that looked at studies that were registered on clinicaltrials.gov. These are, you might imagine, pretty homogeneous studies trying to evaluate treatments for dry eye. But there is diversity, of course. Even within just 5 records for dry eye, we found 18 different outcomes. The FDA, we said, okay, what if we look at a different body of research? You're looking at studies that are submitted to the FDA for approval. There too, we had, even when there are the same outcomes that were reported, because the FDA requires that outcome to be measured and reported, there's quite a bit of multiplicity in terms of how the outcome is measured. So you have 2 levels of challenges: what's important, but also how do you measure what actually is important. Now, why does this matter? So we work within the field of clinical trials, systematic reviews across a range of topics. The idea is not to just summarize the evidence for the purpose of summarizing the evidence. The idea is to inform clinical practice guidelines. So these evidence synthesis activities that are conducted are intended to inform clinical practice guidelines and therefore, therefrom, clinical practice at the bedside. So that's the idea behind this. Just a quick detour, because I'll be talking a little bit about systematic reviews as part of this. What is that? So it's a review of the evidence of published studies, or not, sometimes not fully published studies, that focused on a specific research question. And we use scientific methods that are pre-planned and explicitly specified to identify, select, appraise, and summarize those similar but separate studies that have addressed the same research question. So in these reviews, we find clinical trials, and a bit of a thought experiment now. Let's say if you were to plot the percentage of trials that report a certain outcome versus the percentage of systematic reviews that report that same outcome, systematic reviews on the same topic. And if you plot a given outcome as how frequently it's reported in the trials, how frequently it's reported in the reviews on a plot, and if you divide that plot into 4 quadrants, you can have some scenarios, right? On the top left here, you see that there's a percentage of trials reporting an outcome. You see, in some cases, the ones below the 50%, fewer than half the trials reporting that outcome. But above that, more than half those trials are reporting that outcome. So these are popular among the trials, the ones in the top left. Similarly, you can plot here the percentage of reviews that are reporting a certain outcome. The bottom right is outcomes popular among those conducting systematic reviews. You can have a scenario here where you have a set of outcomes that's not popular among either sets of researchers. And then, of course, the better scenario is you have a set of outcomes that are popular among both that are commonly recognized as important. So we said, okay, with that sort of simple quadrification of types of outcomes, what if we looked empirically at the evidence in ophthalmology? What if we look at the evidence? We did this work in HIV/AIDS as well. We were collaborating with a set of HIV/AIDS researchers at the time. And if you squint your eyes for that scenario, you see a lot of dots in the lower left quadrant, suggesting there's not much consensus, even among trialists and reviewers working on the same topic, as to what's important. Both in the story, in ophthalmology, we did this for the 4 most prevalent eye conditions: age-related macular degeneration, cataract, diabetic retinopathy, and glaucoma, but also among HIV/AIDS. You see here we divided it by sort of types of interventions. So clinical management, behavioral prevention, biomedical prevention, health services as well. And here too, you see the bulk of the outcomes are not popular among either sets of researchers in that lower left quadrant. We took this a step further and we said, okay, how much information are we really losing as part of this process? So we zoned in on a set of systematic reviews that are conducted, all the systematic reviews that are conducted by the Cochrane Eyes and Vision Group. This is a group of researchers and patients and clinicians that do systematic reviews across the field, across various topics in ophthalmology. So what you're seeing here is a graph of on the y-axis, you have of the studies that are included in a particular systematic review. Ideally, you want all the studies to make it into the meta-analysis. The meta-analysis being the quantitative summary of the results. Because if it's not making it into that analysis, it's not fully contributing to the quantitative summary of the averaging of the results. So you see here for about the first, not the first, but about a third, so 35% of reviews, all the trials are making it into the meta-analysis. Good, which means that they're contributing to the systematic review in the fullest possible way. For about 40%, only some of the trials reported included in the reviews. Remember, these are trials addressing the same research question. Only 40%, for 40%, only some of the trials made it into the meta-analyses. And then for about a quarter of them, none did. Meaning that there's a disconnect in terms of what is being reported in the trials and what the researchers who are conducting the systematic reviews are considering important. So much so that we went to the American Academy of Ophthalmology and we said we need to, within the field of ophthalmology, we need to address this problem. We talked about inconsistent use and outcomes across clinical trials in ophthalmology, and we gave this particular case study in a Cochrane review in 2016 of 43 trials addressing the dry treatments for dry eye. Only about 10% of them actually reported the outcome that we were interested in, which was a challenge. So these are problems. Let's now move towards potential solutions. One potential part of the solution is what's known as a core outcome set. I'd submit to you that this problem that I described would not really be a problem if in the top right corner of each of these figures, there was a set of outcomes that everyone was reporting. Then everything else is just additional things that's relevant for a certain topic, that's relevant for a certain trial in a certain situation and so on. But can we agree on a set of outcomes on that top right that everyone in a certain field considers as important? That is exactly what a core outcome set is. It's a minimum set of outcomes that should be measured and reported in a specific disease area. No one's saying only do this. It's a minimum. And then additional outcomes can be added as relevant to a certain topic. So that being said, now, how do you get to that minimum, right? So we want to make sure that outcomes that are included there include things that the patients consider as important, the key stakeholders in a given research question. The outcomes should be clinically relevant. They should be relevant to the clinical decision-making paradigm that exists in a given topic area. The advantages that a core outcome set brings to a topic area is standardization in how that outcome is measured and reported, increased comparability across studies. Now, when you have consistent outcomes and combinability, are these studies combinable in a potential systematic review and meta-analysis? You can also help prevent selective reporting of outcomes, because if I don't like the result of a particular study, of a particular outcome in my trial, if I don't want to report it, I'm going to be a lot more compelled to report it if there's a core outcome set in the field and everyone's expecting that outcome to come out of my trial or to be reported from my trial. So there's three main steps that are followed in terms of development and dissemination of core outcome sets. The first is you say, okay, what's the universe here? What are the possible outcomes that are relevant to this topic area that we're dealing with? And then working with some formal consensus generation process to get from that longer list to a shorter list of outcomes that are determined to be the most relevant. So there's two parts to that. What are we measuring? Also, how are we measuring it? Because a certain outcome, as we know, can be measured in so many different ways. So there's two pieces to that in terms of that consensus generation process. And then finally, once that is agreed upon, disseminating and engaging the field in the adoption of that core outcome set. Okay, this is not a pie in the sky. This is not a new idea. It's been around for a long, long time. Arguably the first, I think, core outcome set that was developed was in the 90s in the field of rheumatology. So for the treatments of rheumatoid arthritis, researchers, clinicians, patients, guideline developers, et cetera, got together and said, here are the 8 outcomes we need every study to report. Otherwise, we're dealing with a situation where we can't decide which treatment is better. So that's what this is. And it really, by going back to that robot vacuum scenario, it helps fill out those columns. Think of these outcomes as the column headers there. We talked about the PET. Does it pick up PET hair? How noisy is it? Whatever we think is important, let's make sure that we know that information for each of these vacuums that we are deciding on. It's the same idea here. For whatever treatments that we're looking at, whether it's drugs, et cetera, here are the 8 things that we care about. We need to make sure that the studies report on this. The pie in the sky actually has had an impact. So you see here a graph of the percentage of trials in the field of rheumatology that have reported that all 8 outcomes in that core outcome set on the previous slide. You see here, the core outcome set was released by the WHO in 1994. The FDA and the EMA then required it. And you can see that the curve went up over time, but it's still not quite 100%. but close to approaching 100% of trials in the field of rheumatoid arthritis are reporting at least those 8 outcomes. So there's impact potentially of this work. So tying it back to the work of the Cochlear Center. So this particular National Academies report just came out this year, and it's titled Measuring Meaningful Outcomes for Adult Hearing Health Interventions. We see Nick Reed, who many of us know was part of this work, and maybe others are on the call as well, or would be unknown to many in our field as well. So this particular core outcome set for adult hearing loss interventions or hearing interventions, they went through, I'm sorry, this is a little small, but the committee that put together, did this work to generate this core outcome set, went through a set of processes that initially identifying and describing outcome domains for hearing, communication, and beyond, and developed an inventory of measures for those outcomes that they were interested in. They evaluated the meaningfulness of the individuals, to individuals and clinicians, the association between hearing difficulty and the outcome, so the relationship between hearing difficulty and the outcome, and then the importance of the measure. These were the 3 main things that they considered. They developed a potential core outcome set, and they evaluated candidate outcomes that would make it into that core outcome set, and then eventually came up with a final core outcome set. They considered 2 categories of outcomes. The proximal outcome that they looked at was audibility, but also distal outcomes in 2 main buckets of hearing and communication outcomes, and outcomes beyond hearing and communication. So thinking about the longer term, or the more distal impact of the intervention or the treatment. So the recommendation as part of this report, they came up with 2 core outcomes that should be used. So individuals and organizations engaging in hearing health intervention should adopt the following outcomes as a core outcome set in both research and clinical settings: understanding speech in complex listening situations, and hearing-related psychosocial health. One of their recommendations in their next chapter gets at, when assessing outcomes in hearing health, clinicians, researchers, and individuals should use the following outcome measures for each of the outcomes in the core outcome set. For understanding speech, they recommend the AFAB Global, or the abbreviated Profile of Hearing Aid Benefit Global Score, and the WIN test, or the Words and Noise test. And for hearing-related psychosocial health, they recommend the revised hearing handicap inventory. Okay, so this is what this panel from the National Academies recommends for treatments evaluating, or treatments for hearing loss, or interventions rather for hearing loss. So giving you a couple of examples, rheumatology and hearing, but actually a lot of core outcome sets are available across different topics now. So you see here, this was as of last year, a diagram that shows that you can see here this fewer for genetic disorders and developmental and learning problems. But if you go all the way to the end of the graph, you see a lot for neurology and cancer. The shades of blue, if you would, are just how recent are these core outcome sets. The darker blue are the more recent studies that were published. Okay, so as you might imagine, neurology, cancer, orthopedics, et cetera, these are quite broad fields, so there are specific ones for specific topic areas, the specific, sometimes within a topic area for different types of interventions, you might value slightly different outcomes and so on. So there's quite a bit of work that's been done across fields to address this topic. So much so now that the WHO guidance for conducting clinical trials across the board now recommends use of standardized core outcome sets. This is as of the one that came out last year. Use of standardized core outcome sets, that is the minimum outcomes, blah, 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 should be considered for all trials to enable the results of studies being compared, contrasted, and combined, for example, in later meta-analyses as appropriate. Okay. So that's the potential part of the solution. Now, I just want to spend some time diving in a little bit to the dry eye field that I introduced earlier. So within the field of dry eye, I talked earlier about how there's quite a bit of variability. You might imagine just dryness of the eye is one symptom, but there's a whole range of different symptoms There's vision issues that can happen. There's dizziness that can happen because of the constant dryness, et cetera. So there's a range of different things that are relevant to this topic area. So we have some ongoing work right now where we've just wrapped up step one of the process. So step one of the process, as I talked earlier, is what's the universe we're talking about? What are the various outcomes that are out there that could be candidate outcomes for the core outcome set? Our eventual goal is to develop at least one core outcome set for dry eye. There's none. We may need to do more than one depending on type of disease, depending on type of treatment, and so on, depending on the population, et cetera. So our step one was to identify potential outcomes from existing research. So I talked earlier about how a few years ago we looked at existing research related to dry eye. That was about a decade ago. We developed a text as part of that process. We developed it in collaboration with optometrists and ophthalmologists. We developed a taxonomy of outcomes across the field that would be potentially relevant for patients with dry eye. So you see here symptoms, you see signs, you see clinical testing. The numbers in parentheses are how many individual outcomes are within each of those categories. You see laboratory measurements, safety or adverse event outcomes, quality of life related outcomes, and then a set of outcomes we put on the other. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but in essence, we have this sort of a detailed taxonomy for each of those categories of outcomes. We expanded on that in collaboration with an ophthalmologist here at Johns Hopkins. I'll acknowledge them later. So as part of that process, we now then have wrapped up a systematic review that looks at what are the outcomes out there in the field of ophthalmology, in the field of dry eye that have been evaluated in clinical trials of dry eye. So to do this, we searched for published randomized controlled trials of any treatment for dry eye in humans of any sex, disease, severity, and underlying condition associated with dry eye, because sometimes dry eye can be secondary to something else, such as Sjogren's disease can cause dry eye. And in any country or setting, we looked at the last 10 years. We wanted to focus on trials that were recent, because these would be more reflective of current day practices and measurements related to dry eye. So we screened using extracts, titles and abstracts, full text, extract and verified data. So we identified over 8,000 records related to clinical trials for dry eye in this period and included a nice round figure of 300 randomized controlled trials. This work, I should say, was led by a master's student who graduated, Yuhui, or she goes by Rainy as well, Rainy Wu, who this paper has now been accepted in Cornea. So this work was led by Rainy, and you see here a range of different categories of outcomes that were identified. So these were, what you're seeing here, those 7 categories that were on a couple of slides ago. You see here the circles are corresponding to how many outcomes we found within each of those categories. And you see the individual blocks are how the individual outcomes and how frequent they were. So clinical testing outcomes like tear film stability is one of the measurements of the ocular surface that is crucial for measuring the status of patients with dry eye. One of the main challenges within this field, that's going to be an important challenge we deal with in subsequent phases of this project, will be there's not a lot of correlation between the measurements that you take in patients with dry eye and their actual symptoms. There's no one particular score that really goes up when the symptoms get worse. So you have disconnects. You have these measurements that stability might be a little higher or lower than usual, but the patient feels great. Or the patient feels miserable. They feel exceedingly dry, but all their visual acuity testing, conjunctival staining of the eye, everything looks normal. So there's no perfect test for this condition, which is a challenge in this field. So symptoms are plenty, clinical tests are plenty, but that correlation is not a great test for dry eye. And then we have a set of outcomes that we identified as part of this work as well. So using that as a legend, here are the 10 most frequent outcomes that were reported across trials for patients of treatments for dry eye. You have tear film stability, that's TBUT. There's an overall assessment of ocular symptoms. There's a few different instruments that are used, such as the ocular surface disease index, et cetera, et cetera. Corneal staining, there are markers of, so because dry eye can involve damage to the cornea because of the dryness, there's this, the more the damage is, the more the eye gets stained when you drop a dye onto it. And that the amount of staining can be reflective of the damage to the cornea. So that's a measure, that's an outcome that's frequently reported as well. Amount of tear production, volume and secretion. Similarly to corneal staining, there's the damage sometimes spreads to the conjunctiva because of the dryness of the eye. That's the the cornea is the part that is in front of the retina, or in front of the dark part of the eye. The white part of the eye is the conjunctiva. The visual acuity, how well can a person see because of the dryness? That can impact the visual acuity as well. Adverse events related to treatments, meibomian gland plugging or clogging. Meibomian gland is a gland next to the eyeball that produces what's known as sebum. And that helps the tears from being evaporated. It helps keep the tears on the surface of the eye. So when that gland is plugged, there's not enough of that sebum that's secreted, which can impact the tear staying on the eye. One of the consequences of many of these treatments is an increase in the intraocular pressure, the pressure inside of the eyeball. So that is an important outcome as well. And then the tear film meniscus height or volume. So how much volume is there in that tear film meniscus? So these are the most common outcomes that are out there. As I said, there's like hundreds of them. So these are the most common ones that are out there. So as part of our engagement in the next step of our project would be to engage with clinicians and patients to say which of these matter the most and which of the others also matter to add to this list. Our next challenge, as that step 2B is related to how do you measure these outcomes? There's so many different ways in which each of these are measured. So you see the number of measurement instruments for patient-reported outcomes. Each of these is a separate outcome. And you see here the overall assessment of ocular symptoms that one of them on the previous slide has actually 25 different instruments. You've got ocular burning and stinging can be measured in 11 different ways. Patient treatment acceptability or satisfaction with their treatment for their ocular surface has been measured in 10 different ways. So thinking about the psychometric properties, the measurement errors that can happen would be a key part of those conversations for figuring out which outcomes and what, as we saw in the case of the National Academies one, not just what's important, but how do we recommend, or which particular measurements do we recommend in terms of how do we measure these outcomes. So another consideration that comes up in this context is, and I alluded to this earlier, different treatments or different types of treatments might mean different outcomes are differently relevant as well. So you see here a little bit of variability for each of the, not too much, but like for tear production, et cetera, you might see variability in that the different color bars here pertain to different types of treatments for dry eye. So for example, you have non-surgical procedures in the reddish color or the orangish color. Supplements are in the lighter green. So you see quite a bit of variability for tear production, anywhere from only less than half the trials are reporting it to all the trials within a given intervention type are reporting that same outcome. So these are conversations that will have to be had in the next phase of the project as well. So I'll start to wrap up here and looking forward to a discussion. The core outcome sets for dry eye, what we've done so far is that initial phase, is trying to identify what's out there, what are the different categories of outcomes, what's the universe about what we might want to focus on next, what are the different intervention types for which these different outcomes might have been measured. So our next step of processes that we are ongoing, and we have some funding now from the National Eye Institute to do this part, the next part of this work, is to generate consensus in the field by getting together the right people. I didn't spend enough time talking about it, but making sure that we have for dry eye, ophthalmologists, optometrists, patients with dry eye, because they're the ones who will eventually take the treatments that are going to be recommended at the end of these trials. Getting buy-in from industry because they conduct a large part of these, a large proportion of these trials. So getting those stakeholders around these tables as part of these conversations to say, we need one core outcome set or we need more than one. And for each one, we need, let's say, we need to focus on which are the outcomes we start with, which are the outcomes we end up with. And thinking ahead about dissemination and adoption. There's a whole lot of body of work that I've not talked about that goes into thinking about how do we change behaviors, right? You may have a core outcome set that's out there, but does the FDA then require it for new treatments that are then submitted to the FDA for approval? That has been done in some other countries. It's potentially might be a challenge getting it done in the US, but that's one option. Other option is working with the developers of these drugs to get them engaged early in the process and say, eventually you're doing these trials, we're going to need you to include these outcomes in your trial. Come to the table at the beginning. Also the patients, are these the outcomes that truly matter to you? Do you care about your corneal staining score? You can't really see that. What do you actually care about? What functional outcomes do you care about? So that's something to think about. And thinking about ways in which to disseminate it. And just a journal article obviously is not going to be enough. How do we get the word out to those doing the clinical trials, those advocating for clinical trials, and the patient communities as well as to outcomes that should be measured and reported. So I'll wrap up here. The acknowledgements that I wanted to make sure I do, Rennie Wu, who led much of this systematic review work as part of her SCM thesis here in our department. She now works at CERTA in California. SN Akpek, who used to be here, just moved to Duke University. Michael Lin is a medical student. Ann Irvin, who is here in our department. And then I have colleagues for this work at the University of Colorado. Riaz was a former graduate student in our department. And Tianxing Li was a former graduate student and faculty member in our department. The two of them and a current PhD student, Daniel Shaughnessy, are at the University of Colorado in Denver. So I'll wrap up there. Left plenty of time for questions, so happy to take those or discussions or ideas and suggestions about some of this work. Would love to hear that.
So we do have one question in the chat.
Excellent. Let's start there. Yeah.
Are these outcomes measured routinely for a visit with an ophthalmologist? In other words, can accessibility to measurement of these outcomes impact how individual studies are conducted?
Yeah, great question. So, and that will be part of, because, I mean, and this ties back a little bit to behavior change, right? If you're trying to change practice, actually, let me take even one further step back from that. What I didn't spend enough time talking about is core outcome sets are typically developed for clinical trials, but most of those core outcome sets are also intended to be used during practice. So the idea is that people, if you're going to measure these things because you've decided that they are important for patient impact, for clinical measurement and so on, they should be things that are going to impact clinical practice as well. So, but there are some core outcome sets that are solely developed for clinical research. But as I said, most of them are developed for both. With that in mind, many of these most common outcomes that are on the list here, I want to say tear film breakup time, corneal staining, tear production volume, visual acuity. So about 5 to 6 meibomian gland plugging, about 6 to 7 maybe, are standard measurements that happen at a routine clinical visit for patients with dry eye. But that is an important observation because we eventually want it to be a core outcome set that is used in clinical trials, but is also informing routine practice. So that's an additional, that's one of the considerations we'll have to make when choosing those eventual outcomes that will make it into the core outcome set.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for the question. Dr. Sklo.
don't know if this is. Here it's just white. It might help. I think this.
Or repeat the question. Okay, yeah, will do. But I'll give him.
Amazing, I've lived for 100 years, didn't know anything about it. Oh, yeah, great talk.
Thank you.
I have some naive questions of someone who doesn't know the area. Number one is risk factors for dry eye, like medications, anticholinergic,
Yeah.
do they affect dry eye? So that's one thing. And the other one, I know people are interested in specific outcomes, but has anyone thought about doing a factorial analysis and coming up with some simplified, because, the 10 most frequently reported outcomes, that's a lot. So that's the second question. And the last question is, do you have to adjust for multiplicity when you're looking at several outcomes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, multi-part question. So you heard that beautifully. So the first part of the question was etiology of dry eye. So it's a multifactorial etiology, as is many conditions. So I talked about two main types. The first kind is called what's known as aqueous deficient dry eye. There's not enough tears that's produced by the tear glands in the eye. That's the one that's most typically impacted by many of the medications that you mentioned. The other kind of dry eye is evaporative dry eye. So there's a range of factors that lead to why there's not enough lubrication on the surface or protection for that lubrication, and the tears just dry up. For both of these, the age is an important factor that's been identified. As the older one gets, the drier one's eyes become. Female sex it has shown to be more associated with dry eye. And then the underlying conditions that lead to less production of tears, autoimmune conditions that lead to inflammation on the surface of the eye. There's a piece of work that we've just submitted for approval that might be related to other inflammatory conditions. So we're proposing doing some work for whether HIV might be related to increased incidence of dry eye, and what might those predictors be, and what might the impact of those predictors be. So we are proposing doing some of that work in the Max and Weiss cohort as well. So a range of different factors. And of course, several times it's unknown. None of these things are true, and the patient has the dry eye. Dry atmosphere. So yeah, so those are factors that like for example, the prevalence of dry eye, I didn't show it on the graph, but I should have. The prevalence of dry eye quite varies, even within the US, for example, we talked about Colorado. In Colorado, such a dry state, the prevalence is considerably higher than in Maryland. So prevalence in the atmosphere, but also inside the room, right? For those of us who have dry eye, who might have dry eye, the symptoms when you're sitting under a vent, for example, the eyes get a lot drier than they would otherwise. Yeah. So I think one of your subsequent questions was on multiple comparisons or multiple outcomes. Yeah. So that's an important challenge to think about when you have a longer core outcome set. So that's an additional consideration. You don't, first of all, for practical purposes, you don't want to propose too long a core outcome set. The more outcomes you propose, the more expensive a trial becomes, the more burden it is on the trialists, on the patients, on the participants in the trial. And also, as you're saying, statistically, you're more likely to get, just by chance, statistically significant result if you have like 20 outcomes in your trial and you do multiple measurement of those outcomes and multiple testing and so on. So that's a concern as well. So it's been said that ideally a core outcome set has 7, maybe up to 10 outcomes, not much more than that. Because beyond that, you start to hit diminishing returns because of these challenges that you occur. And I've forgotten your middle question, I said.
The other one is coming up with some, I don't say score, but factorial analysis or principal component.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen principal component analysis. Maybe there is, I'm just not aware. But many of these scores, like even that I talked about overall assessment of ocular symptoms, One of the common measures that's used in that for that outcome is the OSD score. I talked about it earlier, the Ocular Surface Disease Index. That's got a set of different components to it. And I think that's been validated. I should look into whether they've used principal component analysis to explore some of that for its components. But that's been validated across a different set of populations and a different set of scenarios in which it's measured as well. But even with that score that's measured, that correlates well with symptoms overall, one of the challenges, and this is well documented in the field, and I spoke to it earlier, these measurements don't correlate well with what the patient clinically feels. So that's when you're trying to suggest, at its core, what a core outcome set is, you're telling every researcher in the field to measure its outcome. But when we don't necessarily know that corneal staining, for example, is a good marker of patient symptoms, it's going to be a hard jump to say, now everybody should measure corneal staining. So we just have to deal with that as we go along. But thank you for those questions. Great question. Shri.
Things that we've been confronted with the work that we've been doing, and that I'm curious to get your take on, is how to incorporate time into this, right? So different outcomes. First of all, time may be a component of the outcome. So I do a lot of HIV work, right? So PrEP continuation is something we're interested in. It's very different to be continuing PrEP at 3 months and at 1 year or at 2 years, right? And even with interventions, they often take different amounts of time to have an effect, right? So I'm just curious, even with the same core outcome, when it's measured, makes a big difference. And how do you sort of think about incorporating that element?
Yeah, great question. And just to repeat, because I don't think you had a microphone, it was rough. Okay. So Dr. Shri Schwartz in the room asked the question about time. So when and gave a couple of examples related to, for example, HIV, different treatments might have a different impact on a certain outcome over different points in time. So how do we think about time when we're thinking about developing core outcome sets? And I think it's a great question. Let me see if I remember that estimate correctly, about a third, I think, up to a third, I think, of core outcome sets that have been developed also recommend when to measure the outcome. Now, as you might imagine, and I think as you said also, that depends on the treatment, right? That depends also on the disease severity sometimes. On the type of disease you're dealing with, that depends on how severe a certain subset of the population is presenting to you. You may want to necessarily require participants or a trial to measure that outcome over time. But that becomes another, for a core outcome, I come back to a point I was making in response to Dr. Sklo. That becomes another thing of the core outcome set developer telling the trialist to do. Not just measure this, but here's how to do it. And guess what? Here's when to do it too. But I feel like that it sort of depends on the severity of a condition. It depends practically on resources for a trial to be able to follow participants long enough to measure that 1 year outcome or 2 years outcome or whatever that might be relevant. But that, as I said, some core outcome sets have specified that maybe not for each of the 8 outcomes, but for like 2 or 3 outcomes, we recommend using at least a 1 year follow-up for the measurement of this outcome meaningfully. Sure.
Yeah, I have another.
Please.
Yes.
So the issue of moderate,
Mm-hmm.
like modifier. The any modifiers may impact the outcome.
So the question Dr. Sklo asked is about effect modifiers. And I think the question as worded was, are there effect modifiers that might impact the effect of a certain drug on an outcome? I think that's very topic specific. That's very context specific. So usually the core outcome sets aren't focused on things aren't focused on what might impact the effect modifiers. That I say that, but one way it might come in is that it depends on the scope, right? So you might do for patients with, sticking with the example of dry eye, if we develop one core outcome set for all treatments for dry eye, which increasingly likely it's not looking like that, there's going to be at least 2 separate ones. If we did for one, and let's say type of disease is an effect modifier, I talked about dry eye having 2 main etiologies. We may want to do 2 separate outcomes for those 2 levels of that, or for those 2 for those 2 different types of disease. So instead of thinking about it within the core outcome set, thinking about what we might do is have separate core outcome set for the 2 levels of the effect modifier. For some, another way we might do it is, I talked about how the disease is a lot more severe among female individuals than male individuals. There might be different outcomes that are relevant for those 2 subsets of the population. So we may have to do, I don't think we'll end up doing that, but one option might be to do one core outcome set for female individuals and one for male individuals, rather than specifying within the core outcome set that the outcomes are differently relevant for different individuals. Thank you for that question as well. Please.
Yeah, I'm curious about the kind of what you identified as step 3, the dissemination phase, and kind of what you see as the pathway going from identifying the core set to that actually being widely accepted, and also how long you think that might take.
Yeah, great. I don't know if they heard because I didn't hear the microphone. That was good. Okay. Yeah. So dissemination at such, in fact, we have, I haven't talked about it here, we've done a body of work related to various factors that trying to promote, first of all, measured dissemination, measure uptake, and then what's associated with better uptake. I think so far what we've learned, and others have worked on this as well, is engagement of those eventual uptakers, if you would, early in the process makes a big difference. That's one, using sort of behavior change techniques, theory rather, to identify what are the drivers of that behavior that you're trying to change, and what are the ways in which you might change that behavior, like working through barriers and facilitators, et cetera, makes a big difference as well. Funders make a big difference. So if I'm going to get asked for money to do a trial and my trial funder says, yeah, I'll give you money, but measure these outcomes, that makes a big difference. Regulators, if I'm trying to get my drug or device approved by the FDA or the EMA, and the FDA is going to expect and has on its website, the FDA doesn't, the EMA does, about core outcome sets. It says, go check the database for core outcome sets. That's a COMET database. If you have an outcome in the core outcome set, if you have, we're expecting you to report the outcomes in the core outcome set. If you don't, justify why not. It's not saying we won't approve you, but we need a strong justification for why that outcome's not in your list of outcomes. So getting them, and the Act has made quite a big difference in the especially in Europe, the EMA, but so getting regulators involved is going to be useful as well. But all this ultimately depends on many of the other factors we've talked about, right? Do we have the outcomes that matter the most to clinicians, that matter the most to patients? Do we have not too long a list? Are these measurable? Are we forcing a list of 20 outcomes down each clinical trialist's mouth? That's not going to happen. So making sure that we have an optimum list of outcomes that's going to be usable across the board, and getting that buy-in as early in the process as possible is going to be key. Yeah. Please, yeah.
I guess like we talk about the dissemination of the like the core like awesome side, but like I kind of want to go back to the like more like how this is like being made, because you mentioned that there are usually like an academic society, they have like a committee meeting and then they invite stakeholders. I'm curious about like, you know, who gets to be invited to be sitting on those committees, and when there are differences, when people don't agree with each other like on what to be included, because you can only have so many outcomes to be included. Like who gets to like decide like the thing, right? Like, and I suppose like patient advocacy groups might have very different interest on the set of outcomes than like researchers or clinicians. Like, and when that happens, who gets to decide? I guess.
Yeah. Great question around the process, right? So not all core outcome sets are lucky enough to be sponsored by the national academies, like the one on hearing loss was. But a big part of the process, as you say, is getting the right people around the table. You're obviously not going to be able to get around the table everybody who's going to use the core outcome set. That's just not feasible. So making sure there's representation from different voices and not tokenism. Actual representation in terms of listening, in terms of engaging with each other and identifying these are the outcomes that matter the most, and being able to be flexible and saying, okay, here's a list of 7, but that are determined to be the core, but maybe these 2 or 3 we can add as the next level out. That's not quite the core. But getting from whatever, 100 or 80 to 10 is going to be a hard thing, right? People feel strongly about their outcomes of interest, things that they care about, things that they don't care about. But there's no other way to get it happening other than getting people around the table and getting consensus. So there's formal methods to get consensus among groups, one of which is the Delphi process. There's various other methods that are out there that can be used. The most popular one is the Delphi one. But usually these happen over 2 or 3 day meetings. The National Academies took many months to do it because I think they went through a set of processes to conduct that systematic review, zone in on the ones that are most relevant, have those engagement efforts, et cetera. But these happen, the way this works is the way we would typically do it is we run Delphi surveys online and then have a full two-day in-person meeting or a 3-day in-person meeting to pour through each outcome, to each of those measurement instruments, the challenges with them. And heated discussions will definitely happen, right? But ultimately, it is the idea that eventually it'll get to a point of consensus. Sometimes you have core outcome sets with pieces of dissent written at the end. And that's fine, sort of like a court ruling, where a dissent at the end says some individuals did not buy on to this particular outcome because it's not relevant for that. But not all of them do, but there are some with dissent. Great question. Yes, please.
Is there any kind of like procedure in terms of reevaluating core outcomes, like rollback of these measures?
Yeah, that's great question. So the question is around, is there a procedure towards reevaluating or rollback of core outcomes that are initially thought to be core? Yes. So what we might choose to be core now in 2025, or when we get it done in maybe 2026, may not be true in 2035, right? Things may evolve, treatments evolve, our priorities evolve, what we know about a disease evolves. So updating of core outcome sets is recommended, not necessarily always changing it, but evaluating whether it needs to be changed. Usually it's suggested every 2 to 3 years. And then as needed to actually reconvene the process, but then don't start from the very beginning, start with that set, see what new stuff has been published since then, append to it, and then have a conversation again of the same kind we've been talking about to decide on what the updated set will be. But that's an important thing because things change over time, yeah. Especially for some of those, if you saw in that blue graph with cancer and all that, some of those were developed like 15 years ago. So they may need and do need updating. Yeah. Any more online questions maybe?
Done with no more online.
No more online. Seems like no more in person as well.
Well, I thank you so much again, Ian, for being here. This was a great talk. Thank you for everyone in the room and online for a really robust discussion as well.
Yes.
Also want to thank Mindy for helping putting all this together, and Katie, who's our captioner today. We appreciate all your efforts. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again in October. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.